What do you think the first human thought when they contemplated death? What do you think the first human imagined life after death would be like, if it was anything other than, well, death? It's hard to wrap your brain around. Our ideas of death and what may or may not come after, it's often a byproduct of our surroundings, circumstances, culture, and a whole bunch of other things I don't care to list. But that original idea, the thought of what could exist beyond our last mortal breath, I promise you it did not come from nowhere. But the truth, the cold, hard truth, well, that's complicated. And how you feel about it, I guess that depends. I promise I'm not being evasive about it or anything like that. That's just how complicated things work in general. As for who I am or why you should believe anything I'm about to say, I don't really think that matters. I could still give you my name, but it really wouldn't tell you anything. To be honest, I don't entirely remember my name. It's been so long that I'm getting ahead of myself. But I promise it'll make sense when all is said and done. However, I can't promise it'll sit well with you. Nor can I promise your perspective on life, death, and the afterlife will remain intact. This really isn't the first time someone has tried to get this message out. I doubt it'll be the last. But if anyone takes my word seriously, that's honestly enough for me. Because nobody, no one, living or dead, deserves this fate. To explain, allow me to share a simple anecdote. Years and years ago, it really doesn't matter how long ago it was or where it happened, a man named Mort lived a full life. There's nothing historically significant about him. You won't find his name, actions, or life story in any history books. He was just an ordinary guy, making the most of his circumstances. There were certainly good times in his life, but there were bad times as well. And yeah, Mort did his share of good deeds and bad deeds. And if you tried to add up all the good and bad in his life, you'd get a messy mix at best. But, like everyone, Mort eventually had to face death. His last years weren't exactly comfortable, but they weren't agony either. He died as peacefully as anyone could have hoped for in his circumstances. And by then, he had a pretty good grasp of his faith, his culture, and how he perceived death. So when the time came, he thought he was ready. And after he drew his last breath, he was forever detached from his body, his spirit freed from its mortal coil. He then felt himself transported somewhere. He didn't ascend or descend or anything like that. He also didn't see a bright light or a dark pit. He didn't even have a concept of his current form. Mort just knew that he was aware, he was dead, and he found himself in a strange place. Eventually, he finds himself in front of this large, imposing gate. From the outside, it looks so inviting, glowing with a radiance that rivals all the stars in the night sky. But it also looks off. It does not match any depiction of any story he's heard about the afterlife. He doesn't know if this is heaven or hell or something else entirely. But the gate is there, and a part of him wants to enter. But before he can even try, he feels a presence, a very powerful presence. It has no body or form, at least not in the way any human would understand it. In Mort's disembodied mind, he believes himself to be in the presence of the divine. It could be God Almighty, the embodiment of multiple gods, or some divine power that's indistinguishable from God. The details really don't matter to him. In the presence of this being, Mort is humbled and in awe. He gazes up with a reverence that's entirely understandable for a finite mortal mind. But before he can say anything, the being before him speaks.
Be not afraid. You have lived your life. And in that life, you have made many choices, some noble, some misguided, and some that were simply wrong. But they were yours to make. Now, as you traverse death, you have but one more choice.
Mort, still overwhelmed and speechless, can only watch as the gates before him open. He cannot enter, but he's close enough to sense that there's something beyond, an existence after death. There was more light, but there were also shadows. There was a distinct allure, but also this inescapable reluctance, like a lifetime of faith and doubt clashing from within. The divine figure remains by his side, as if to allow the inner conflict from within to play out. Forever how long it rages, the being finally speaks.
The choice is simple. Pass through the gate and enter heaven. Continue to live after death, to continue your experience after your life has ceased. Or, you may simply end it here. Let this moment be final. Return to the same state you were in before you came into existence, and that shall be your fate.
It was a simple choice, but one with the greatest of implications. It was very likely the last and most important choice Mort would ever make. He looks towards the open gate and then back at the divine figure. In his disembodied mind, he continues wrestling with every spiritual inclination, every religious tradition he's ever followed. The choice might seem obvious, but there was still that lingering reservation. This divine being, it said nothing about whether he had been good or moral. It did not mention any of the evil, selfish, or misguided deeds he had done in his life, nor did it mention the good, selfless acts he had performed. This was indeed strange. In every tradition he'd ever heard about what came after death, there was some sort of divine reckoning for how one conducted themselves in life. Mort was no man of great legend or spirit. He had never aspired to be more than he'd been. But even with this undeniable inconsistency, the choice before him still seemed clear. I choose heaven. His voice trembles with excitement, but the divine being next to him had little reaction. There was no elation, no relief or approval. If anything, there was a sliver of disappointment, but it was too small for Mort to notice.
Very well. If that is your choice, go. Enter heaven. Experience life after life.
Finally unbound, Mort passed through the gate and entered heaven. And for most, this is where the story ends. You might even consider it a happy ending to a life well lived. But this is where things take a disturbing turn. And if you're religious or spiritual in any way, you might want to brace yourself, because this is where souls, minds, and millennia of traditions tend to shatter. Because what I just described with Mort is not unique. In fact, it's so common that it's outright mundane. I know this because I have the privilege/curse of watching it play out so many times. I'm really not exaggerating when I say I've lost count of how many times I've witnessed this. But every time I see someone make the same choice as Mort, I feel this horror and disgust that's too great for words. How do I see it? Why do I see it? Both questions actually have the same answer. Years ago, I'm still honestly not sure how long it was, I too was a mortal man just like Mort. I lived a life that was mostly normal. The only difference between me and Mort is when the time came for me to make that choice, I just couldn't. Couldn't decide whether to enter heaven or just end it right there. And that, I believe, is the response the divine being resents most. It's hard to know for sure. This being, call it God, the divine, the ultimate creator, it might not have a face or form, but trust me, you can sense when it's upset with you. And it was definitely upset with me. I will never forget the words it spoke when I refused to make a choice.
That is very disappointing. For if life left you incapable of choice, then let your fate be resigned to watching others who can choose, and may you bear witness to the consequences of that choice.
There was no malice in that divine tone, only dismay and disgust. I get the sense that this being resents people like me the most. I know I'm not the only one to refuse, but I'm still confident in stating that, as unenviable as my current situation might be, it's still not the worst. Because the harsh, soul-crushing truth is, those who made the choice that Mort made, they are burdened with a truly awful fate. They think that choosing to enter heaven is some kind of ultimate reward. But trust me, it's not. I would go so far as to say that heaven, the real heaven that so many souls willingly enter, is truly the worst of all hells. Go back to Mort for a moment. I was nearby when he made his choice. I watched from afar, dreading what he would do. But when he chose to enter heaven, I knew how it would play out. And I had to watch it unfold yet again. It began with elation. Mort entered what seemed like a peaceful, pristine domain. There was beautiful light, breathtaking landscapes, and fields rich with bountiful, joyous treats. Just imagine everything you could possibly desire. It was all there in abundance, ready to be enjoyed to the utmost. And at first, he did. Mort enjoyed every succulent indulgence that heaven had to offer. He even got to enjoy it with others who recently passed and made a similar choice. For a time, there was jubilation. Everyone was free of want and suffering. Everything was just so perfect. But more time eventually passed, and after a while, even the great joys of heaven became mundane. There was no novelty. There were no complications, failures, setbacks, or challenges. Everything was just too perfect. As such, Mort and others like him struggled to enjoy heaven as they once did. But they continued living it, as there was literally nothing else they could do. More time goes by. Eventually, enough passes that it grossly exceeds whatever time they spent alive. And by then, heaven isn't just mundane, it's boring. And eventually, no matter how strong your spirit might be, the boredom starts to get to you. More and more time keeps on passing. Every moment and experience becomes more muted. Every joyous feeling becomes increasingly numb. And the very concept of eternal life in heaven begins to feel infuriating. Finally, Mort and others like him get to this very particular point. I call it the eternal realization. That's the moment when the line between joy and suffering vanishes. The entire concept of both just losing all meaning. There's really nothing left but this flat, dull, never-ending existence, one that can never be exciting, fulfilling, or anything that makes it worth experiencing. This culminates in this agonizing breakdown. That's when those such as Mort finally cry out to the divine and lament. Please, let me change my choice. I just want this to end. It's said in many different ways and in many different languages. Even if I don't know the language, I can definitely recognize the sentiment. This poor soul has finally realized the true cost of their choice. But it's already too late. And the divine figure always responds to them the same way.
What you chose cannot be unchosen. You lived your life. You may have even valued your life. But life only has value when it is finite. Those who choose infinite life do not appreciate such value. As such, this heaven you now experience, or this hell as it may feel, that is of your choosing.
What usually follows is a prolonged outburst of anger, resentment, and disdain. Mort eventually joins the endless sea of souls, maddened by never-ending mundanity, numb to all joy and fulfillment. If they still had fleshly bodies, they would all have the same expression: broken, distant, and in utter despair. They know the only one who can free them from this heavenly hell is the same divine being who gave them that fateful choice. They spend every moment praying, begging, demanding even that they be allowed to truly die. But this divine figure, it does nothing in response. It hears their every cry, but it grants them no mercy. I observe all this from afar. Some might consider me more fortunate, for I and others like me are granted some reprieve on occasion. As far as I know, those who never made a choice are the only ones even capable of such reprieve. When, why, or how it comes, that is not up to me. It is only the will of the divine that decides. I don't know how much longer I can stand to be in such a role, watching countless souls make the same fateful choice as Mort. I feel like I'm always on the brink of completely succumbing to maddened despair. But if there's one thing that keeps me going, one sliver of hope that helps me retain what little of my soul remains, it's occasionally witnessing those who choose not to enter heaven. They're put in the same situation as many. They're never coerced or guided in one way or another. They simply make their choice, revealing to the divine that they do value life, and they value it for the right reasons. I feel like the divine respects them for that. Even if theirs is the harder, less common choice, their capacity to make it gives me comfort and solace. For me personally, I can't help but envy them. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that those in heaven envy them as well, because their lives retain value, being finite and complete, whereas heaven renders every life pointless, boring, and bland. Perhaps that same envy is what drives me to send this message. I doubt I'm the first to send it. The divine only permits it occasionally, hoping to offer perspective amidst a sea of conflicting theology, beliefs, and religious traditions. But it stops short of informing mortal souls directly, lest their final choice be obscured or wrongly influenced. There's just so much more I could say about this choice, about heaven and the hell its occupants ultimately experience. But I am only permitted to say so much, and I have no assurances that this message will be heeded by anyone. I can only share what I have observed, knowing I can never do justice to the anguish of those who choose heaven over the value of their life. Because, like it or not, this is a choice that we all must face. Death comes for us all eventually. We are never truly ready when it arrives. But when it comes to that final, fateful choice, I'll only say this: choose wisely. Because if there's one thing I've learned in all the time I've been cursed to observe this unholy gambit, it's that heaven, no matter what form you think it takes, eventually becomes hell. The power of every god that has ever existed is surely vast, but even that pales in comparison to the power of unceasing, unending, everlasting boredom.